In this video, I'm going to be performing quite an interesting modification to this 2017 15-inch MacBook Pro. Now, for those of you who don't know, the 2016 and 2017 models were the first year of the MacBook Pro to switch from a removable SSD, at least in the case of the Touchbar models such as this, to a soldered onboard SSD. Now, for those of you who have used or have even looked at these machines, these have been regarded as some of the worst, if not the worst, MacBook Pro models ever made. And the reason for that is mainly due to reliability, but is also due to the absolutely atrocious butterfly keyboard that these machines use. And of course, they remove all forms of upgradability, or at least easily upgradable hardware, such as the removable SSD, as I mentioned. Now, like I mentioned in this video, we're going to be performing quite an interesting mod to this machine, and that is we're going to be removing the onboard soldered SSD and replacing it with an NVMe SSD, a removable NVMe SSD. And the way we're going to accomplish that is by using this modification designed by iBoff right here. Now, this PCB, as you can see there, is named the IATO 7, and basically what this is it's a PCB that breaks out the PCI Express I/O normally used by the soldered-on onboard SSD controller, and simply breaks it out to a standard NVMe connector right there. So if we go ahead and flip it over here, you can see what I mean here. On the back of the board, you can see there's quite a few solder pads there. And these, of course, will be reballed and then will solder in place of the original onboard SSD controller. Now, I should mention that this upgrade is compatible with both the 2016 and 2017 15-inch and 13-inch models, but it is not compatible with the 2018 or later models, as those use the horrible and absolutely terribly implemented T2 security chip. Now, if it weren't bad enough that these are the most unreliable machines, the 2018 model with the introduction of the T2 chip made it even worse, if you can believe it or not. But yes, these machines are bad, I know that, but despite that, we are still going to be performing this mod on the better of the two models. So of course, the pre-T2 models, despite their terrible design, are actually better than the later 2018 T2 models. So with that, of course, the first thing we need to do is disassemble the machine and remove the chips that are in the spot of where this PCB is going to solder on. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get this machine taken apart, get the logic board removed, and we will go ahead and begin with the process of desoldering the original chips that this will replace. Alright, so as you can see here, I've gotten the board prepared here, got it completely removed this little shield here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to remove this metal shield that's around these three chips here. And as you can see, the chips under here are underfilled, so we will have to obviously remove underfill in order to get these chips removed, but that shouldn't be too big of a deal here. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my hot air station warmed up, and then we'll begin the process of removing this metal shield here. So I don't know if I'm going to need a preheater or not to get this off. I'm hoping I don't, because I really don't want to put this on the preheater because it makes removing underfill a little bit more tricky because it kind of burns your hands as you do it. So we're just going to do it right here on this silicone mat, and hopefully this will be hot enough to remove this shield here. It shouldn't be an issue, but we'll see. We'll just start by getting the whole board warmed up in this area first. Okay, so it is coming, for sure. It's a little bit too hot. Now, most of the components in this area we are going to be removing, so we don't have to worry too much about being super careful here, but may as well be as careful as possible. Alright, and that's the metal shield removed, so that will make it a lot easier for us to get in here and remove these 3 chips and get the underfill and everything removed. So I'm going to prepare my underfill tool for doing that, and then we can begin the process of desoldering these 3 chips. Alright, so we'll just go ahead and start off with this one here. This is a NAND, this is the main controller, and then this is another NAND, and there are a couple more NAND sections around this board. I think there's just 2 more on the back. There might be more, but I think that's it. But those can stay on the board. We only need to remove these to make room for the breakout PCB. The first thing you want to do here, as I'm doing here, is removing all of the underfill around the perimeter of the chip. And we'll just go ahead and do that to all the chips here. Alright, and now that with all the perimeter underfill removed, that'll prevent any surrounding components from coming off with the chip. Not that that's a big deal in this case, since we're removing all those components anyway, but like I said, it doesn't hurt to be extra careful. So now what we need to do is use the hot air to remove each of these chips. Now normally when I remove chips like this, I would use flux, but because these chips are underfilled, I'm not using flux, as not using flux will make it a lot easier afterwards to clear all the underfill out from them. You can see that chip is already removed there, so that can come off like that. We can do the same thing with this chip here. And lastly, we will remove this chip right here. Alright, so there's all those chips removed. Now before the board cools down too much, we first need to clear all the underfill off these pads here. And this is why not using flux helps. Because I didn't use flux, there's no liquid on this area. So when I remove all this underfill, it's just going to kind of flake off and get blown by the hot air instead of making big clumps if there were flux on the board. Now like I said, all these components are going to have to be removed anyway, so I'm not going to be too careful, but for now we'll just get the underfill off and make sure everything looks good pad-wise. So you just want to get this up to solder melting temperatures on the surface here, and then we can use this tool to just scrape the underfill away. Now there are some resistors right here and right here. I'm just going to scrape those away because we don't need them. In fact, I might just go ahead and scrape away all these components. You do need to keep, I think, this set of capacitors, but everything else can be removed. So now I'm just going to go ahead and use this tool to scrape away some of these other components here. Alright, that's pretty much all the components now removed. I just need to make sure that all the underfill is completely scraped off of all this area, because any tiny bit of underfill will cause the board not to sit flush to this board, which obviously would be an issue for the solder balls making good contact. So I'm going to go over it one more time just to make sure I get every speck of underfill. Okay, and that's looking really, really good now. So let me clear off some of these residual components that were left over here. I will, of course, have to clean this board off afterwards because it made a big old mess. But anyway, with that done, we're now going to get the soldering iron out here, and we're going to go and basically put flux over this whole area, wick it to make sure there is no solder on there at all, and then we'll be fully prepared to install our breakout PCB. So first I'm just going to apply flux to this whole area. And the only components that need to remain in this spot are these two little capacitors right there. So as you can see, I've left those in place. So let's turn off the hot air since we don't really need that right now. Let that cool down, and then we'll begin the process of cleaning all these pads off. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is just take some fresh solder and just apply it to as many of the pads as we can. Now as you can see, some pads did come off during the removal process. That's no big deal. Those are just going to be no connect pads because they were just literally stuck to the board and nothing else. So we're just going to get as much solder on these as we can to begin. And with our pads nicely tinned, we're just going to go over them all with some solder wick to remove every piece of solder we can. Alright, and that looks really good there, so now we'll just take some rubbing alcohol on a paper towel and remove all of that burnt flux. Alright, and that's feeling really good. I don't feel anything that's, raised, no pieces of underfill or anything like that. So I think this board is now prepared and ready to install our custom PCB here. Now before we install this PCB, I've actually got to apply some solder balls on it as it came unballed. So these are just empty solder pads at this point, and I've just got to put some solder balls on them. Luckily, a stencil was provided with the kit here, right here, that we can use to reball it successfully. So I'm going to go ahead and get everything cleaned up here because there's a lot of components and stuff all over the place. And then we can begin the process of reballing the breakout PCB. Alright, so as you can see here, I've gotten the stencil aligned to the board, and I've got it all taped down here on my little platform here. So now what we're going to do is just use solder paste to reball this board. And the reason I'm going to do that is because these balls are so small that it's going to be very difficult to use actual solder balls, and the stencil is thick enough that the amount of solder paste in each hole will be more than enough to bridge any gaps between the board and this board. So we'll go ahead and just start by applying a little bit of this to various different spots of the board. And then we'll take this tool here and just kind of push it down into each hole. Alright, and with all the solder paste in the respective holes here, now we'll just go over it with the hot air and melt all the solder paste into their respective holes. Alright, so that looks pretty good. Now I'm just going to apply some flux and heat it one more time just to ensure all the balls fully melt onto their pads. Alright, so that looks really good there. All the balls look to be even. Actually, let me go ahead and show you that close up here. Alright, so as you can see there, that looks all pretty good there. You can see all the balls look uniform. It's kind of hard to tell in some spots because the flux is a little bit blobbed up on there. But you can pretty much tell that all these solder balls are even. Every pad has a solder ball on it, and we should be all ready to go here. So with that, I'm going to get the board on the preheater this time, and then we'll simply begin the process of soldering this board onto the MacBook Logic board. Alright, so as you can see here, I've gotten the board on the preheater now. So now is when now is probably going to be the most difficult part of this whole process. So for this, we need to get the board aligned pretty much perfectly, just because these solder balls are so small here, or these pads. And in theory, as long as we get it aligned almost perfectly, we should be good to go, but it's going to be a little bit difficult, that's for sure. So with that, the first thing we need to do is apply flux to the pads on the board. I don't really need it in a lot of these spots, but I'm just going to make sure everywhere where a solder ball might be does have flux applied. Just like so. So now we need to take the NVMe breakout board here and align it into position. Now, the corner of the board here should align more or less with this corner of the board. So we'll start with that, and I might have to turn this off because it's pretty hot here. I try to align it by hand the best I can, but he has also provided on this board some little holes here, which you can use to align it with little pads in that section of the board, which does help quite a bit as well. So we'll do that here. Alright, so that looks pretty darn good right there. So I'm going to turn the hot air back on, or the board preheater rather. Actually, it's definitely quite difficult to get it aligned. Alright, so I think that's good right there. That looks really good. So I'm going to turn on my hot air with no nozzle to probably about 300 degrees Celsius, and we'll let that warm up. And then once it's warmed up, I'm just going to go ahead and heat the board and solder it into position. Alright, in theory that should be soldered. I mean, it's definitely got up to solder melting temperatures for lead-free solder at least, or leaded solder at least. So we'll let it cool down. I'll check it just by tapping on it and see if it even soldered at all. And then from there we can begin the process of finishing up the mod by tying some of these pins to certain parts of the board and stuff like that. But hopefully this worked, and I can check by using diode mode to ground to see if all these seem to be connected as intended. So let's see now. It should be cool enough, and it definitely didn't solder at all. Alright, well I guess we'll try that again. Actually, let me remove this. I didn't even think about that. That water damage indicator might be enough of a raised area that it won't work. But we'll try to solder it on one more time and see what happens. So now I need to get it aligned again. Alright, that definitely felt a bit better and looked like it fell down into place that time. So let's wait for it to cool down once again, and we'll check it one more time. Okay, it's definitely soldered now. It's not moving, so that's good. So there, I'm going to go ahead and take it off the board preheater, and I'm going to measure it off camera with a multimeter in diode mode, check the diode reading of each of these AC coupling capacitors to ground, and if all those check out good, then we know that at least all the main data lines are connected appropriately. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and do that check and resume the video, and then we'll go from there. Alright, so after a bit of trial and error, I could not get it to solder properly with the solder balls created with the solder paste, as I thought would be okay earlier. So I ended up having to take it back off the board. I had to reball it a second time, but this time I used 0.3mm solder balls and also pre-tinned the pads on here to add a little bit of extra height as well. And that got it fully soldered properly. I tested diode mode from here to ground on all those capacitors and on all these other test points up there, which he helpfully labeled with a little arrow in the silkscreen there. All those test good, none of them are shorted together, and all of them read what they're expected to in diode mode. So in theory, all the pads are correctly soldered to the board. So the next thing we need to do is we need to solder these two wires here. So we need to solder a few wires for a 3.3 volt source for the SSD itself. We need to solder this wire for reset, and then we also need to solder a third wire to set clock rec L to low all the time for the SSD here. So I'm going to get the camera back up in the tripod and we will proceed with soldering those extra wires. Alright, so actually before I proceed with soldering the wires, actually the first thing I want to do is get this connector installed, because that'll require some hot air which could cause the wires to come off. So I definitely want to do that first. So to do that, I'm just going to use my board preheater here along with some hot air and then manually solder it with a soldering iron after I get it secured with the hot air. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn the preheater on, get the board warming up, and then I'm going to tin each of these pads with some fresh solder. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is apply some flux, of course. And then I'm going to take some fresh solder and just tin the pads. Just like so. And hopefully we won't even need to use the iron to manually solder it, but if some of the pins don't look to be soldered, then of course I will. So with that, we can simply take the connector here and just align it appropriately. The board actually has little holes in it we can use to align it. So that right there is perfectly aligned. So now we'll turn on the hot air and just heat it to solder it onto the board. Alright, so for some reason the alignment of these holes isn't quite right, it seems. So I might have to go over these manually, at least the ones on the back here. There we go, much better alignment there. So that looks pretty good. I am going to just check it a little bit myself off camera just to make sure all the pins are correctly soldered. And if not, I'll go ahead and go over it with an iron. But from just looking at it here, they all look perfectly soldered just with the hot air, so I don't think we need to do anything more. So with that, now we can get the board out of the preheater and we can begin the process of soldering the 3 bodge wires to these pads right here. Alright, so we're now ready to begin connecting the wires to this board. And the first wire we need to connect is the 3.3 volt rail. So that'll connect to that 3 volt pad right there. And then that only has to connect to right here. There's these 2 pads here. I'm going to put a bunch of solder on it and bridge these 2 together because they're both on the same rail. And then we can solder a wire to connect that to this board. And of course, this SSD is going to pull quite a bit of current, about, I'd say 3 amps or so is what it's designed to pull. So we do need a bit of a thick wire there in order to make this work as expected. So first, let's tin these pads. Just like that, and then we'll tin the 3 volt pad there. And then we will take this little wire here that I've pre-cut and solder it here. See if I can. And that's pretty good there. And then we will solder it to these pads right here. And just like that, we've got our 3.3 volt rail connected. And that little wire should provide plenty of current capacity for the 3 amp rating of the SSD we're going to install here. And I'm just going to check it, make sure there's no bridging with the adjacent pads, because those are ground. And that looks good there. So the next thing we need to solder is the reset wire. And for that, I can just use the standard 0.1 millimeter copper jumper wire that I usually use. So we'll get some of that here. We will start by tinning the end of that wire here. Just like that. And then we'll tin the reset pad on the board here. Solder the reset wire. Just like that, and then that needs to connect over here to this probe point right there. So I'll make sure you can see that there. Yeah, so it needs to connect to that probe point right here. In order to do that, of course, we'll just tin that probe point. Put some flux on it first. Okay. Then tin the wire in the correct spot. And just like that, the wire is soldered appropriately. So that looks good, and we only need to solder one wire now, and that will be SSD clock rec L, or clock rec LBL, and this is all in the iBoff guide, which I'm following to install this, of course. And then that just needs to be grounded somewhere. So we'll just take another length of wire and basically just do the same thing. And the reset probe point is that probe point right there. So that's tinned. Take our wire and solder it over there. And it looks like the closest ground point is going to be this capacitor right here. So we will simply solder it right there. And that's it. Alright, so with that done, I figure I may as well show you a close-up of what was done. So the first thing I needed to do was solder this wire here to those 3.3 volt pads right there. There are two of them that I bridged with the wire to the 3 volt pin of the board there. Reset goes over here to that probe point right there. You can see right here. And then the clock rec line goes from there to that pin of that capacitor, which is just ground. So that will always keep that clock rec line active because it's active low. So that's all we need to do to finish this upgrade basically. So I'm going to go ahead and get the machine assembled. We'll put an SSD in it, and I've actually got the SSD right here. As you can see here, this is a 2 terabyte SSD. And of course, due to space constraints, obviously, you can't use a full-length NVMe SSD. This specific SSD is a 2230, I believe is what it's called, sized SSD, or 2230 is what it is. You can also use a 2242 SSD in this. However, that'll kind of impede on this shield right here a little bit. So I think the 2230 sized SSDs are the best ones to use for this. And the original SSD in this machine was 500 gigs. So this 2 terabyte drive will definitely be a good upgrade. And of course, now it is user replaceable. So with that, I'm going to get the machine assembled. We'll give it a test. And there's one extra step we need to do after we make sure everything works. And that is remove power to the other 2 NANDs that are still on this board, because obviously they won't be in use anymore. And then the last thing I'm going to do is ultrasonic clean the board in order to remove all of this residual flux. So with that, I'll get the machine assembled, get this SSD installed, and we will give it a test. Alright, as you can see here, I've gotten the board partially reassembled in the system. I left all the covers and most of the screws out, but I did screw it together enough so we can put the bottom case on, flip it over, and test it. But as you can see here, I've got the SSD installed. As you can see, it fits in there pretty decently. And when you put this in here for the final time, it's recommended to put a little piece of adhesive down underneath the SSD between the board and the drive. But since this one is just temporary, it more than holds it well enough as it is. So we should be good there to at least test it. So with that, I've already got the battery plugged in, so let's open it up and turn it on. And in theory, this activity LED should flash if the machine is trying to read data from this drive. So let's go ahead and see what happens. And as you can see, it already flashed. It's flashing a few times there. So that is a good sign. Everything looks good so far. So I'm going to put the bottom back on this system. We'll flip it over. You can see it tried to access it again. That's a really, really good sign. So we'll put the bottom on, flip it over, and we'll get a copy of macOS installed onto this system. Alright, I've gotten a copy of macOS Ventura installer connected to the system. So let's go ahead and power it on and see if the installer detects the drive. Alright, so that's good. The Ventura installer is detected. Alright, so that's booting up here. I'm just going to go ahead and stop the video here and resume it once the installer has finished booting successfully. Alright, so as you can see, the installer has booted. Let's go into Disk Utility. And there it is. I did test this before on another Mac. There it is, the 2 terabyte NVMe SSD that's installed into that breakout PCB. That is really cool. Let's go ahead and erase it here as APFS. Macintosh HD. So far so good. Let's close this. And let's install a copy of Ventura onto that drive. There it is, Macintosh HD. And just like that, Ventura is now installing onto that NVMe SSD. That's so cool. Well, anyway, I'm just going to wait for this to finish, and once it's done, we'll resume the video and see how it works. Alright, so as you can see here, the machine has finished installing macOS, and everything is working absolutely perfectly. You can see the touch bar is working, of course. It installed the T1 software update as soon as it booted, and everything seems to be working absolutely perfectly. So let's go into more info here. There it is. You can see the 2 terabyte SSD is fully detected. We'll go here, we'll go to NVM Express, and there it is, that Western Digital SN740 SSD detected and working perfectly. So the last thing I want to do here is I want to run a speed test on the SSD. Now this SSD only has 1 NAND on it just because it's so small, so I don't expect it to be quite as fast as the original SSD, but I'm going to go ahead and run a speed test anyway, and we'll see exactly what kind of read speeds we get on this drive. Alright, so as you can see here, I've got a disk testing utility installed, so let's go ahead and see what the read and write speed is. Alright, that's actually better than I was expecting for a single NAND SSD. Look at that. Awesome. So we get about 3,000 megabits per second write, and about the same in read speed. So that's really good, and as far as I'm concerned. So that has been the successful upgrade of this 2017 15-inch MacBook Pro from its original soldered SSD to a removable user upgradable NVMe SSD. Now, if any of you want to try this modification, iBoff does sell this kit, which includes the board and everything else you need. And of course, the guide to install this is located on the iBoff webpage. So I'll put a link to both in the video description, both where you can buy it and the guide to this installation, or the guide for this installation process. So with that, hope you enjoyed this video.